Now, as the later life lending market expands and with the regulator casting an ever brighter spotlight on the subject of advice and consumer outcomes, the issue of advisor development, training and competency has never been more important. To help me explore this vital subject, I have some of the industry's leading commentators representing key stakeholder bodies. Joining me via video link, I have John Somerville, Head of Financial Services Professional Education at the LIBF, Tish Hanifan, Founder and Joint Chair of the Society of Later Life Advisors, and Matthew Jupp, Principal of Mortgage Policy at UK Finance. Welcome to all of you and thank you for joining me today. John, if I can turn to you first and ask, what do you see as the key challenges facing this market at the moment?
Well, Stuart, as we see it, one of the big challenges is that as the market for equity release grows, the bigger the silos become between advisors. So we find that advisors are falling into generally two camps. Some who support equity release really thoroughly, understand it and understand how the marketplaces move forward. And also there are also another set of advisors who fall into the camp of being very wary about the legacy that equity release has left behind from many, many years ago and probably haven't moved with the way that the equity release market has moved forward. So I firmly believe that consistently high quality consumer outcomes will rely on advisors maintaining their knowledge, which will ensure competence is maintained. Coupled with this, advisors should work into their process a reliable network of mortgage and financial advice that they can do a really sort of very professional handoff in the circumstances where it's needed. So if they can't advise in a certain area, but they understand where the needs are, because a lot of the advice they give will have a knock-on effect to things like inheritance tax and what have you, and they need to give that professional handover. So I think certainly as a challenge at the moment, I think, the behaviours that we would want to see in the marketplace need to shift a little bit so that they incorporate a more holistic approach. But when we say holistic, that needs to incorporate financial advice and mortgage advice alongside the central equity release advice.
And Tish, what's your take on what John's just said?
I completely agree with what John has just said. I mean, one of the challenges for the equity release market is that it is a growing sector, and that means that you need to encourage more advisors to come into the market, but you need the advisors to have the right skills and the right competencies. And in support of what John said, I would say that one area where there is a challenge is that the silo for advice does, as he says, get bigger if you still have that view that some 5 people in financial services don't do equity release, as they call it. And that just cannot be the way forward for financial planning. For financial planning, you need to be able to offer that overall holistic view. So, for example, in the Society of Later Life Advisors, all our members have to have the equity release exam. Now, they might not have to be able to transact the business, but they have to be able to see where equity release would fit into the overall later life planning. And then for those advisors that are not regulated to do equity release advice and they don't have the mortgage exams, exactly as John said, the way forward is to build relationships with specialists who do. But it's definitely the case that mainstream advisors cannot see equity release as something on the edge of financial planning. They definitely have to see it as part of the holistic overall structure, particularly if you're working in the area of later life advice.
And Matthew, just bringing you in on the same point really, from the UK finance perspective, what do you see as the key challenges in this market right now?
Well, I mean, if you look at the consumer position now from where it was 10 years ago, it's just completely changed for consumers. Generally speaking, people have sort of 2 large assets when they enter retirement. They've got their property and they've got their pension pot. The restrictions around their pension pot changed a few years ago with pension freedoms, and there's increasingly different ways and diverse ways of using their property equity as well. So finding out the best way of using those for each individual customer and each individual person is becoming increasingly difficult. Those diverse options for consumers make it difficult for financial service providers. Consumers need information at the right time, and then when it comes to the actual crunch time, they need to make some choices. They need to get really good and expert advice from people who really know what they're talking about, who have the right training and expertise and the right experience, and actually that they can trust. And the difficulty with the market at the moment is it's very siloed, and it's hard for people to actually know which part of it they have to interact with and how to get the best information that they need, and how to ensure good incomes. I guess the overall difficulty with the market is that we need to make sure we are all working better together to provide the information and advice that customers need.
Tish, if I could just turn to advisor development and training, what's the Society of Later Life Advisors doing to help with that?
In answer to the question, what's Solar doing? Two things really. Right from the beginning, when I founded Solar, I was very clear that what I was trying to achieve was an organisation that provided all-round holistic later life advice. So all the members do have to have the equity release exam. I think that's really important because it means that even if they don't do the advice themselves, they understand enough about where equity release plugs in, fits into the kind of advice that they need to give as later life financial advisors, and then they can refer that on if they need to. So we require that equity release is a part of the exams. They have to have what we call underpinning knowledge to go forward to the later life advisor accreditation. And on top of that, we obviously provide training needs, not just for our members, but for people wanting to get involved in the sector. So we do quite a lot of training for people coming at all levels of entry to look at how equity release might fit into the market. And we're just, and I say really just, launched a new later life lending advice standard, which is the difference with Solar maybe and other organisations is that we are a consumer-facing organisation. We're not a financial services organisation. And therefore, this new later life lending advice standard is focused around giving consumers one, trust and confidence, which they can take from the Solar brand, that they could find an advisor who could help them. And secondly, an objective we'd love to achieve would be to try and negate this very old historic view about equity release being a problem. Because if you look back, and I did recently, it's the 1980s since there was a problem with equity release. That's such a long time ago. The market has moved on so much. We want to instill consumers with confidence, and the later life lending advice standard is one way we hope we can do that.
And John, what's the LIBF's view on this in terms of advisor development and training? What help is your organisation offering advisors in this space?
Well, Stuart, you probably remember, actually, it seems like an awfully long time ago now, but pre the pandemic, we held a series of round tables around the country where we invited equity release advisors, so actual practitioners as well as business leaders, to give us their thoughts on how an awarding body could help with professional development. The conclusion was that equity release advisors would benefit greatly from the subjects they don't deal with on a regular basis, so the things that they don't do day to day, but which their advice can actually have an effect on. So as a result of this, we've run a series of 6 workshops last year, all on webinars, in conjunction with UK Finance, and it covers the areas of pensions, income tax, state benefits, inheritance tax, and you kindly came along and actually contributed to the vulnerable customers section of this one. It went down really, really well, and at the end of it, the advisors gain a digital badge to show and prove their competence. So it's our digital badges are secure badges that they can share with consumers and they can share with colleagues and friends, where you click on it and it takes you to a site that shows exactly what these people have done and gone through in order to earn that badge for the CPD that they've done. The great news is it was such a success that we're going to run it again starting from next month. So the details for that are on the UK Finance website. Myself and Adrian Crowley, who ran it last year, we're going to be running it again. Same set of subjects, and we've got an introductory webinar at the very start of April, which is free to attend, which will give you a little bit of background about what we're doing. We believe this is one of the areas that we can help to plug the gap in people's knowledge and help bring the industry forward a little bit. Because obviously we don't want to tread on the toes of what the great work that's going on with some of the training providers and some of the networks out there. But what we want to do is be able to sort of try and narrow that gap between the silos so that people work more holistically in the same way that Tish has already mentioned.
Matthew, the UK Finance recently announced a joint venture with LIBF to launch a series of webinars aimed at helping advisors working in this space. Tell us a bit more about that, please.
Yeah, I mean, UK Finance primarily represents mortgage lenders, but we're aware just how important financial advisors are for consumers and ensuring them that they can make the right choices. We're also aware that there's a bit of a gap in terms of continuous personal development for advisors, in getting some fairly useful, quick, snappy information about how best to proceed in certain ways, and filling the gaps in their knowledge. So, yeah, we're working with the London Institute of Banking and Finance to provide a series of webinars for advisors in particular, where they can kind of plug in some of the gaps in their knowledge. And if you go onto our website, you'll be able to find out more information about that.
So John, can I just turn to this incredibly important subject of vulnerability? What do you think are the key challenges facing advisors right now working in this space when they're dealing with vulnerable clients and vulnerability?
This is probably number one on most people's lists at the moment, Stuart, isn't it? I think it's coming out of the pandemic is going to be a real struggle for the core client base that Equity Release is based in. This is probably the number one for me. Those that are vulnerable will find direct contact with advisors very challenging because they're the ones that are the vulnerable people. So actually the worries around actually going out and seeing people again, being in contact, direct contact in their homes or in offices and that sort of thing. They're the very people that will show signs of vulnerability, and it'll be more difficult to determine that remotely as well. So I also think there will be much increased level of vulnerability across the country on top of this. So, people will be making decisions because there's an increased demand for the service, for Equity Release service, but that increased demand may be coupled with vulnerability in itself being the driver for needing the money. And of course, this is a real dilemma. It's kind of one of those self-fulfilling prophecies where one will lead to another automatically. And of course, what we want to do is try and avoid, through sympathy. And I know many Equity Release advisors will want to do the right thing by people, almost, because they're vulnerable. They want to, the money is probably the most important factor in their lives for helping family or themselves out during the pandemic, when actually it's probably a knee-jerk reaction in the wrong way. They'll end up wanting the money for the very, very wrong reasons, for the reasons that actually vulnerability is driving in the first place. I think this is by far and away one of the biggest challenges the Equity Release market is going to face over the coming weeks and months in the advice space. Forgetting what difficulties and struggles that lenders are going to have with criteria when it comes to Equity Release and that sort of thing. I think this is by far and away will define us as an industry. This will define advisors for the next few years by coming out of this with a clean bill of health, especially with FCA scrutiny going on at the moment. By coming out of this with a clean bill of health will make all the difference when it comes to saying actually the Equity Release service in the UK is stronger than ever and providing the right outcomes for customers.
And Tish, if I could put the same point to you, would you agree with what John's just said there? What's your view on this issue of vulnerability?
Well, again, I completely agree with what John said. And if you think about it, the FCA had already, over a number of years, highlighted vulnerability as a key aspect that they thought was important that financial services should address. And at Solar, what we had done is we brought out a vulnerability training program, a computer-based one. And last year we had 6,000 advisors take that. It's just a free online exam. It can be found on our website. But we updated it for 2021 to take into account some of the things that John has just identified there, that sadly the pandemic has given us direct experience of. So, for example, the issue around taking instructions remotely, yes, it's true that we may well go back to, and who knows, it will vary from firm to firm, going back to direct contact again. But dealing with people who are potentially vulnerable remotely, as now has been the case, has been a real challenge. It's been a challenge not just for the consumer, who may have found that a struggle. And in fact, the interesting thing is that in many ways, one of the few good things that's come out of it is that people who felt that technology wasn't for them, and they just therefore didn't engage, which is potentially a consumer detriment and an aspect of vulnerability, have actually almost been forced by circumstance to take in part. And there's a whole lot of people doing Zoom calls and working who never would have done it before. So there's a positive aspect on vulnerability. But there's also, and our advisors see this an awful lot, real issues around dealing with someone remotely, being able to have the right empathy and soft skills, because they are very different. We've all found that. It's completely different to be speaking to someone remotely. And the way that clients, where you try and build empathy with clients, translating that into doing it remotely has its own challenges. Another challenge that we have found as well is the challenge of ensuring about financial abuse or just financial coercion in some way. Because obviously there are circumstances where people use the equity they have or use their own money to help another generation. And that works really well when it's done freely, it's done willingly. But if there is even the slightest suggestion that someone has put any kind of pressure on them, it's much harder to deal with that remotely. So learning to pick up skills like being sure, is the person on their own? Could you tell from their demeanour whether perhaps they were listening to someone else or someone else was there? Those kind of things are a real challenge too. And although it's important, and the FCA always highlight this, that vulnerability, older people are not per se vulnerable. In other words, although older people may be more likely to become vulnerable, just because someone is elderly doesn't mean they are vulnerable. But statistically, older people have a higher likelihood of there being some aspects of vulnerability. And equity release with the later life sector requires, therefore, that a lot of advisors who maybe haven't had to address issues around, for example, powers of attorney. How do you dealing with someone who maybe is giving you instructions via someone else? All these things, potential vulnerability, are important in the equity release market. So I think vulnerability is something which, as well, John mentioned, one of the aspects of vulnerability is a life event, and never has there been more of a life event than there is now with the pandemic. And so it's really thrust vulnerability right into the forefront of what advisors must be sure they're able to deal with.
And Matthew, if I could bring you in on that point as well, what's the UK finance perspective on this issue of vulnerability?
I think Tish made a couple of really good points there. And both of them I'd like to pick up if I may do. Firstly, there's the point around our experiences over the last year. I think it's probably worth saying that the financial services industry is not alone in this. The whole country's had to change its way of working. And to take a completely different industry from ours, the healthcare industry has moved away an awful lot, and I know this because my wife's a specialist nurse, has moved away from face-to-face interviews to actually doing stuff over the phone and using video conferencing. But I also know that from her experiences and others, that actually that comes with its own problems in terms of understanding and assessing people, because you don't have the body language, you don't have somebody's reticence, you can't feed off somebody else's interactions the way you can do in real life. And I think we're all going to have to get used to that. And it's not an insurmountable problem, but it is one that we all need to start thinking about and actually put in place different policies, different procedures, different ways of working that mean that if we lose something by not interacting face to face, then actually we can gain things in other ways, and we can make sure that we aren't causing any issues by not having those interactions. On Tish's other point, just in terms of vulnerability and how important it is, absolutely, it's moved so high up the agenda, from government, from regulators, and the media. It is one of the key things that we all need to be thinking about, and I think that's the important thing. It is something that we all need to be thinking about. The vulnerability affects so many different people. I suspect that all of us will be vulnerable at some point in our life, and at any given moment, huge numbers of people are. It's not enough anymore, if it ever was, to have vulnerability as a kind of add-on, an afterthought, something that's done by a group of people within the organisation. From top to bottom, now every single person needs to be thinking about vulnerable customers, need to be thinking about vulnerability, and making sure they take into consideration in the way that they work, the policies they devise, how they interact with people, and they need to do that as part and parcel of their thinking right from the very beginning. So it's not something you can be doing later on down the line, attacking onto the end of things. It really needs to be absolutely centred to the way that the whole financial services industry behaves and operates.
John, if I could just pick up on a further point, for advisors looking to operate in this space, in the later life lending market, what are the key things that they should be doing and focusing on, concentrating their efforts on?
There's a number of things actually, Stuart. So, first of all, obviously, the minimum requirement going for the certificate from our good selves, and we find a lot of people obviously taking that, finding that actually it takes them so far, but there's a lot of learning left. And interestingly, we get a lot of comments around, well, actually, the certificate only does so much. Well, it's only designed to do so much. That's the thing that people need to realise. There is a minimum set of requirements. And if we go any further within a qualification, the problem you have with doing that, let's say, for instance, you start talking about vulnerability within the qualification. We have a broad view of vulnerability within it. But as you know, Stuart, this is changing on a weekly and monthly basis. To keep a qualification up to date with all the latest things on vulnerability, we've got to leave it at a certain point. So, of course, it's the advisor's responsibility to then continue their studies. So to move on to things like CPD, to go to CPD events, start recording that. And we see very strongly under the senior managers and compliance regime that's come in recently that employers and networks and firms need to prove the competence of their people by whatever means necessary. And the FCA has left it down to them. They haven't actually defined a minimum level of CPD requirements for advisors. They haven't defined what that should be. They've left it to individual firms and individuals to define that competence for themselves. Now, that's an interesting concept in itself. So where do so that brings us neatly onto your question, really. What can advisors do? Well, there's a huge amount out there, Now, first of all, our friends at Solar here, what a fantastic way of, I think everybody recognises Solar is challenging. It's a lot of hard work to achieve what the standards that Solar have brought into the marketplace. But actually, what a way to prove how competent you are. Secondly, obviously attending CPD events. Ours is one of many that are out there. And thirdly, training events that are available as well. There's lots of those around, and also training events within individual firms. Now, if you're an individual that is operating on their own, these things can be quite tricky to find or, to get onto. But I'd urge any advisor to seek out that constant professional development and to keep it relevant to what they're doing. And of course, it again brings us back to the silo thing. Understand what other advisors do, broaden your network. So if you're not able or capable of supplying that advice for an advisor, that you've got a professional handover to somebody who can continue that for you. I think it's so important to have all of these parts of, if you think about it as a jigsaw, Solar is one part of the jigsaw. We're another part of that jigsaw, but the other bits they need to fill in themselves. Effectively, it's like having a jigsaw and throwing away the lid of the box without the picture. So you've got no picture, you fill in the gaps. And that's the way the FCA have defined this. They've said, right, ultimately, there's a picture here. Ultimately, the pieces fit together. Over to you to prove how that works. And I think that's, so really advisors need to go out and look for all of those pieces of the jigsaw to put them together. And I think that they're all there. And I think as an industry, the equity release industry is really good at trying to draw those together. For instance, I'll reference the Equity Release Council's new learning framework and the competency framework that they launched in the last week or two. It really does give advisors a running track to go on, and it gives examples of the sort of things that they can do to upskill themselves. But of course, it's down to those individuals to find what those things are.
And Tish, just picking up on that point that John's just made there around CPD, a really important one. There isn't a formal framework for CPD in our markets. Should there be?
I absolutely think that that's what we should be pushing for. All other professions have a very structured CPD, so they do obviously allow for flexibility within that, but there is a base structure that everybody is aware of, which sets a minimum level of competence that has to be defined by keeping yourself updated. And really, evidence of keeping yourself updated in a formal way is absolutely key to being able to demonstrate professionalism. We would expect exactly that from, say, a GP, from a doctor, from a solicitor, and I think we absolutely should expect that from professionals within the equity release sector.
Just to come in on the back of that, actually, I can, if you think about what's available as a track to run on for this sort of thing, the Equity Release Council have recently released their new competency framework, which for supervisors is something for them to use as a pathway to competence. Now, it doesn't fill in all the gaps. That's down to, defining what it is that's going to get that competence for that advisor. But it does give you the elements of what you can take an advisor through to get them to that level of the high level of competence that we'd expect.
I completely agree with John around the need for a framework, and the fact that the Equity Release Council have now produced a framework from which advisors can work onto. It clearly does. What it does is exactly as he says. It just shows you where the gaps are and sets, in the word, the actual answers in the name of it, a framework around which you can set your competencies and work your CPD programs. So very much in favour of that. And I think as well, when you're looking at what advisors can do, it's a very well made point that there is so much around in terms of CPD that's available from the product providers, from organisations such as ourselves, from the LIBF, from things such as this symposium, which brings together a huge range of people. I think the other thing that I would support that John said is that when you do things like this, such as events, when you're networking, whether it's virtually or whether it's, we hope one day in the real world, it's really important for advisors themselves to get to know and network with people who clearly specialise a little bit more in the areas in which they don't. So the holistic approach means that you must be doing CPD, not just directly on exactly what you do, but on, as we've talked about today, the wider aspects. So in equity release, that would be looking at the wider aspects around, for example, care funding, how that would impact upon, equity release would impact upon issues such as care. Now, when you're doing training, one of the things you need to be doing as well is to be talking to people who clearly do a little bit more in that area and have a specialism, and build yourself a network of people so that you're sure that when you give advice, either you know the answer or you know someone that does.
Matthew, what's your view on that? What's the UK finance perspective on this issue of CPD?
Yeah, I largely agree with what John and Tish have just said there, really. Professionalisation of the sector is really important. Continuous personal development is hugely important for everybody. It's probably particularly important in this sector for those people who don't deal with older people or later life lending on a day-to-day regular basis. But how that should be structured, what the actual framework for CPD should be in place. I'm probably going to bow to the LIBF and Solo on that one. But yeah, it's hugely important, and we fully support advisors taking it.
John, the FCA has recently raised 3 points of concern around the equity release market. What's your view on those areas of concern?
Yeah, it's been an interesting one, actually. And obviously, as with any FCA investigation or comment or results of reports and that sort of thing, it's often concerning, and people get worried, and advisors get a little bit worried about these sorts of things. The interesting thing about those 3 areas is that they have a strangely familiar ring to them. I've been in financial services for nigh on 30 years, and I think that these particular criticisms have been levelled at financial advisors and mortgage advisors in the past, and it just seems to be doing a circle now and coming back round to equity release advisors. So I don't think there's anything desperately new in this, except for one thing that I've noticed personally, and certainly talking to colleagues and contacts within the equity release market, is that most people who operate in this market feel that the industry is far further along than probably the FCA gives them credit for. I personally think they're right. I think that we've got an awful lot of experience of management, senior management and advisors who have previously worked in different regimes under mortgages and financial advice, and have carried that experience forward into equity release advice, which is great news because, this isn't seen as a move to try and find somewhere where there's less regulation. This is seen as a move to actually professionalize an industry that is growing, and is much needed. So, this is a real opportunity for people to help others, but in the right way. So I ultimately think that most advisors treat this seriously, but with the professionalism it deserves, i.e. they do truly believe that we're on the right path to proving competency, and ultimately the FCA will see that.
Matthew, just bringing you in there, anything else you wanted to add on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to echo John again here, but really, to be honest with you, you read the FCA's comments. It's hard to argue with what they're talking about. It's should people be getting advice that's personal to them? Well, yes. Should you be making sure that customers get the right products for them and their individual circumstances? Yes. Should you be evidencing your advice? Should you be able to show you working out? Yes, absolutely. I think we can all perhaps discuss how much we do that as individual firms, and I'm pretty certain if you spoke to every single advisor and firm in the country, then they would have their own view about how much they're already doing that, and I think that's fair enough. I think we can talk about it and we can discuss it a lot, but fundamentally the aim of it is to ensure that the customers get good outcomes. I think we can all agree with that. So I think us having a bit of a look at ourselves and making sure we are behaving in exactly the way that we think they are and we hope we are can only be a good thing.
And Tish, from a solid perspective, what's your take on that?
I think that was a really interesting point that Matthew made about with regard to the requirements of the FCA. I mean, a really valid one. With our Later Life Advisor accreditation, we actually have a part which is a face-to-face viva, and you're not testing their people's skills of knowledge, you're testing their skills in talking appropriately to clients, reflecting the fact that there may be challenges relating to the later life sector, maybe in vulnerability. So I think that's a really important part. Another small part that I picked up, which I suppose because of a legal background resonated with me, was going back to this silo part again. There are some things that really demonstrate that you don't need to be experts in everything, but you do need to know when alarm bells should ring. So the FCA mentioned, for example, that there were cases where people had tenants in common. That means they owned a proportion of their property and someone else owned a proportion too, often husbands and wives. It might be 50-50, 60-40, whatever. The alternative is to own it as joint tenants. Now, if the FCA highlighted there were occasions where people who were tenants in common were advised by equity release advisors to become joint tenants because that widened the possibility of the number of products that they could advise them about. Now, whilst that's true, that might widen the number of products available, if you don't actually have a real good understanding of what it means to turn from a tenant in common back into joint tenants, and importantly, what impact that has on things such as a will, that could lead to huge consumer detriment. So I think it was a small example, but a good example of how the overall need is to know what you don't know and know someone that does. And that's what the FCA were concerned about, that there was still too much of a silo in the advice that's given in the equity release sector. And that can be easily covered by the things we've mentioned today that are so important, the whole aspects of training. So it's not an insurmountable problem, it's just one that the FCA have highlighted and everyone, I think, is and should be increasingly aware of.
Tish, one final question. I wondered whether you had a view on what does the industry need to do to really focus on and ensure great customer outcomes?
If I had to say what we should do, I think we should do more of the same. So I think the equity release sector is being very responsible. I think the product providers, the trade bodies such as the Equity Release Council, the advisors themselves are all wanting to see the rising standards reflected in good outcomes for consumers. So what would we have to do? We've said it before, it's repetitive, but it's repetitive because it's the truth. Training, the right training, specialist technical training, so you really know your stuff around equity release and you know the products, and goodness me, you know the market, which is changing all the time. Look how much innovation is coming in. I wrote a book on equity release for Age Concern probably 10 years ago, and I look at that now and I see how much more innovation there is. So technically keep up to date, but along with that as well, make sure that you don't go too narrowly down the path of knowing about equity release, that you fail to have enough holistic advice to do it really well. I think that's what they could do. And going back to consumer outcomes, Solar is, and as I said before, a consumer-facing organisation. And what we hear all the time is how important that is, how important it is to be the right kind of people, to have a soft approach. And I think finally, the other thing which the FCA did highlight as well is to, in terms of holistic understanding, to understand what the long-term implications are of equity release advice at whatever life stage you advise at. So for example, at 55, it's really important that when you do that, if there's not going to be consumer detriment, you know enough about the wider implications to know what that will look like when Mr. Smith is 55 or Mrs. Smith is 75, what it would be like for them later as an individual, and if they're married, what it'd be like with as a couple. So that making sure that you don't give short-term advice, I think and make sure you know the long-term implications, I think would be the final bit in what I think means it would give consumer good outcomes.
And John, could I ask for your view, please, on what the market needs to do, what the industry needs to do to really focus on great customer outcomes?
I mean, it's there's so much that can be done, but first of all, I think it's worth acknowledging how far equity release has come, and Tish has highlighted that perfectly. You know, you look at a book 10 years ago and look at where it is today. I think that's, says it all. The other thing that's a big change from 10 years ago to now is technology, and I can only I think advisors already know this, but you really do need to embrace all technological improvements going forward. I think this is probably one of the most vital things to be able to keep up to date, not just with the products and services. And I have to say, this is something that can be, a criticism that can be levelled at many aspects of financial advice and mortgage advice and equity release advice, is not to be led by product. So many times, the products, that this is what's available, therefore I will hopefully make the steps fit to get to that product. That's got to be tossed out the window. And I think in the advice market as a whole, we've come an awfully long way. There's still work to do. In other sort of areas, I think the best outcomes are always achieved by fully informed decisions which come from fully equipped and highly educated advisors. So what's important there is that advisors must be able to impart that knowledge in simple, client-friendly terms so that they get what it is. And you've got to educate your customers, and you've got to educate their families. And it's not a case of educating them in the way that you believe is the right thing. It's what they believe is the right thing for them. And so don't be led by products, be led by your customers. You're not there to influence them, you're there to educate them. I think it's just so vital. But also, all advisors are kind of guilty of this. If you can't explain it well enough, then you possibly don't understand it well enough yourself. It's a famous quote from Einstein, and it never be, within education, it really does ring true. Understanding learning something is one thing. Understanding it enough that you can impart that information to somebody else that they understand it is a real skill. And a behaviour that is lost on some people. And you do need to make sure that you practice and understand what you're getting across to people. Sometimes I say to people when they're speaking out loud or, talking, in presentations and what have you, when was the last time you actually practiced to make sure that you could do things smoothly, that you were describing ththings in a nice, easy, consistent fashion? Have you recorded yourself and then just, listen to yourself play it back? I mean, you can see the guitars behind me, Stuart. So, this is a classic example of not one guitarist in the world was born. They all practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced, even Jimi Hendrix. So throughout everything that we do, practice is so important in making sure that you can get things across nice and understandably for all consumers. And I think that really does gain, that's my L&D hat on, as you can probably appreciate, but that does really gain the right kind of outcomes for consumers once they understand things and that you've got it across to them nice and clearly.
Matthew, if I could ask for your view, please, on what does the market need to do? What does the industry need to do to really focus in on this incredibly important point of great customer outcomes?
Well, I don't think there's just one thing. I don't think there's no end point to this. It's not the point you kind of all turn around to each other, give yourself a high five and say, brilliant, from now on, every customer's going to get great outcomes, and we can just kind of sit back and relax. It's all about making little changes, sometimes making fairly big changes, but actually just constantly reviewing, constantly looking and constantly thinking about what you're doing to make sure you actually are delivering the best possible outcomes for customers. So that's, making sure you've got the right training, making sure you've got the right processes in place, making sure you've got the right checks in place, making sure you're using the right language and thinking about the customer in the right way, and continually improving what you do and making it better. I think there are some things that we can do as an industry, and I think key to that would be making sure we all work together, and actually that the different parts of it that seem different to us, but perhaps may seem less clear to the end consumer. Making sure that we actually work together and help to explain all that to consumers is really important. But otherwise, I think it's just doing more of what we already do on a day-to-day basis, which is making sure that we do things better and better all the time.
Well, that was fantastic. Thanks to my guests, John from LRBF, Tish from Solar, and of course, Matthew from UK Finance.